Well, thank you for joining us for our morning lecture today on Robert Henri. We're starting a new series of lectures at 11, so watch out for them in upcoming programming guides. My colleague Ran Suk Yoon will be our next one at 11 on April 25th. Talking about Tintoretto. So, and as we put out our summer brochure, we'll have some others listed in the 11 a.m. time slot. Robert Henri is an artist that I feel a close connection to. As a budding art historian, as a graduate student, I began working for the Terra Foundation for American Art, and my colleague there, Shelley Abelera, was writing her master's thesis on Robert Henri. And she said, why wouldn't you want to write your thesis about such a great human being? And she gave me a copy of his book, The Art Spirit, which is a fabulous book. It's a compilation of his teachings, and I'll mention it later again in my talk today. But it's a wonderful book about art and art practice and appreciation. Also, I want to acknowledge Derek Cartwright, who is a professor at the University of San Diego, who has also shared with me so much about his knowledge of Robert Henri, having pursued research on him for over 20 years. Robert Henri is an artist that is completely connected to this idea of place. He traveled frequently. He was inspired by the people that he met and the locations he visited to create portraits and occasionally landscapes. He felt that travel and geography and meeting people from diverse backgrounds was a central part of his artistic practice. And I wanted to start today with a quote by one of my favorite writers named Yi-Fu Tuan, and he was a longtime professor at the University of Minnesota. And in the book, Place, Art, and Self, he wrote, "The word nurture says two things about us, that we feed on places and artworks, and that so fed, we grow. The self, in other words, is not fixed. We continue to discover who we are as we open ourselves to new sources of nurture and experience." And when I read that quote by Yi-Fu Tuan, it makes me think very much about Robert Henri, because as an individual, he was not fixed. He traveled and saw diverse places and depicted them in his art. And it's because of that experience that he is, in part, so known as both an artist and a teacher. Up on the screen, we have the painting in our collection. It's also right over here to my left, so you can see it in person after the lecture. I wanted to put this painting in context and then also talk about it more specifically. A nice portrait of Robert Henri, a dashing man, and an early painting, 1902, in New York. Robert Henri was born in Ohio. Robert Henry Kozad was his birth name. He traveled in the western part of the United States with his family as a child and young man, living in places like Nebraska and Colorado. Some have said that experience of living in the western part of the United States in the late 19th century was the early inclination to think about topography, exploration, the American West as a source of inspiration, as a catalyst for his later travels abroad and to other parts of the United States. Due to a family scandal, his father had shot a man in self-defense, and a few days later, that man died. Robert Henry Kozad changed his name to Robert Henri. His parents changed their names, and his brother changed his name as well. And different names, yes. So there was a lot of shrouded sort of in mystery around Robert Henri as he become a successful artist, because he would often not give specifics about his biography. And it wasn't until decades after his death in the 1950s where people started to put together his own personal history. Robert Henri studied art formally at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts under American painter Thomas Anschutz. Thomas Anschutz followed the great Thomas Eakins as one of the most prominent instructors at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Thomas Eakins is a central figure in the study of 19th century American art. You know, in the years following the Civil War, there were two major trends in American art. One was focused on American experience, American landscape, American identity, and the other trend looked more abroad. The trend abroad would be embodied by the paintings of John Singer Sargent, who looked very much for European sources in his work, whereas the Hudson River School landscape painters and Thomas Eakins, so drawn to the American scene, American genre painting, that was his trend and what he espoused at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. By the time Henri enrolls at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Thomas Eakins is no longer there. Thomas Anschutz is now kind of the most significant painter teaching, but very similarly, they told their students to look to America, to look to the United States for artistic inspiration. And that was a really profound experience for Robert Henri, and he really promoted that later amongst his own students. Henri developed quite a following in Philadelphia. He taught at a number of schools in Philadelphia and later moved to New York, where he became the sort of figure in charge of a group later known as the Eight. And artists like George Bellows, George Lukes, William Glackens, John Sloan, Guy Pendubois, some of the most important American artists working in New York in the late 19th and early 20th century all looked to Robert Henri for guidance. They all visited Robert Henri in his studio and were so taken with his call to action to depict American life, to find inspiration in the world around you as opposed to looking for other sources, whether they be European or far away. Robert Henri and this group of significant American artists became known as the Ashcan School, which really is such a misnomer because the idea of like an ash can makes us think of something pretty icky and awful. And in fact, what they were really painting was more of an urban realism. You know, documenting, capturing the spirit of New York as they saw it. More than naturalistic renderings, they wanted to document a feeling of the streets of New York. You can see in this work here, this snowy scene, this urban landscape by Robert Henri from 1902. You know, it's not the kind of grittiness we might come to expect from something called the Ashcan School. And yet it was the sense of a fleeting moment and you know, the way in which the paint is applied to the canvas in a rigorous manner with quick, intentional brushstrokes. In an issue of the American Magazine of Art released in October 1916, Oliver Tonks, then a professor at Vassar College, wrote this about Henri. Knowing Mr. Henri's preeminence as a portrait painter, there is a tendency to confine one's attention to this phase of the artist's talent. But if one yields to this impulse, an injustice is done. For the street scene shown in this exhibition was a convincing representation of a smudgy, snow-covered thoroughfare on a murky, lowering day and showed the artist perfectly able to handle themes other than portraits. This quote by Oliver Tonks, though not specifically about the painting I show you here, relates to it quite well and brings up this issue that, you know, we have a landscape painting in our collection by Robert Henri. We're going to show you a lot of landscapes today, but Robert Henri is really known as a painter of the people, a portrait painter. We recently had Sara Cash, a great curator of American art from the Corcoran Gallery, visit our museum, and she said the same thing I did when I became familiar with this museum's permanent collection. Oh my goodness, you have a Robert Henri landscape. because most museums, when you visit them, you see the portraits as opposed to the landscapes. In a 1934 article, a writer for the Chicago Daily News stated the following: Robert Henri might have developed into America's greatest painter had he not chosen to become America's greatest art teacher. Henri taught at the New York School of Art and later at the Art Students League. As I mentioned, he inspired the group of artists that became known as the Eight, and so famously showed their work at the Macbeth Art Galleries in New York in 1908, in direct opposition to the more traditional practices of the National Academy of Design. At the New York School of Art and the Art Students League in New York, Henri furthered his aims of inspiring new generations of artists and happened to teach a few names that we would know quite well. For example, in this picture, we have Edward Hopper, Rockwell Kent, and again, the painter Guy Pendevoix, who I mentioned previously. While this picture from the New York School of Art shows a class of men, it's worth noting that Robert Henri was also extremely influential to many women artists. Just a number of years ago, the museum at Brigham Young University staged a wonderful exhibition and published a book on the American women modernists that Robert Henri inspired and mentored. And if you look back at Henri's letters, he remained in correspondence with a number of his former female students and continued to encourage them to pursue art. In fact, it was a female student who compiled the book, The Art Spirit, that gives us such a window into the artist and allows us to think about his practice more specifically. The work on the left, reminiscent of the European painter Frans Hals or even Diego Velasquez, shows that while Henri championed American art, he was also interested in what was happening abroad. His attention to place and his interest in locations and the people that he met was not confined to the continental United States. And in fact, he did spend time abroad, studying at the Académie Julienne under the academic painter William Bouguereau. He traveled to the Netherlands, where this particular work in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was painted. He actually painted this specific model about 7 times that we know of. That was very typical of Henri. He would meet models, meet subjects that inspired him, and paint them again and again and again. His distinctive brushstrokes, his rigorous application of paint, the quickness in which he would apply paint to canvases is evident in the treatment of this blouse. The way the figure emerges from a dark space, a dark background, is very reminiscent of those European artists he was so inspired by, like Velasquez and Frans Hals. This particular work was done in Haarlem in the Netherlands, in the community in which Frans Hals had lived for so many years. He spent time in the Netherlands, he spent time in France, but it is perhaps Spain that Robert Henri had the longest connection with. He did travel to Ireland, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but Spain was a place that he traveled to again and again and again. And so inspired by it, he would bring groups of students to Spain to walk the galleries of the Prado, to experience the landscape of Spain, and to meet the people that he encountered. In his book, The Art Spirit, Robert Henri is quoted as saying, "No nation as yet is the home of art. Art is an outsider, a gypsy over the face of the earth." The landscape on the right, I think one of the things that's really striking about it is his treatment of the clouds, the billowy clouds that sweep into the composition. The woman on your left is, very much similar to these types of works that he would create in the diverse places he traveled. He called them types. He was looking for these different types of people. In hindsight, in revisionary art history, we might question whether he was exoticizing the people he met, including elements of traditional clothing. He was an outsider to these communities. How well did he know his subjects? From Henri's writings, we certainly can glean the fact that he was not as aware, he wasn't really thinking of it in that way. He wanted to remove the academic traditions of the academic point of view from portraiture. It has been said that he democratized portraiture by depicting so many different types of people over a prolonged period of time. One of the things that's very interesting about the work created in Europe, the portraits created in Europe, is that certainly the backgrounds are cast with very dark hues and dark colors. The Spanish work in particular has this really dramatic feel to it. And we think again about Velasquez, perhaps more contemporary artist Ignacio Zuloaga. An interesting sort of contrast, though, is thinking about the paintings of someone like Joaquin Sorolla, who when he came to the United States, the Spanish painter came to the United States, he saw America in bright colors, in whites, in yellows, whereas Henri, the American painter in Spain, sees these portraits and figures in much darker, heavy tones. You can also see, again, this kind of interest in these essential aspects, as he saw of Spanish culture. Like he has the bullfighter, the flamenco dancer. He sees these individuals, his subjects, as certain types of representations within Spanish society and culture. Another place that Henri was inspired to visit was San Diego. And you can see from this is Spain, this is San Diego. Robert Henri's color palette is never brighter than when he is in Southern California. It was another woman, former woman student, an artist by the name of Alice Clobber, who was from San Diego, very involved with the Fine Arts Gallery of San Diego, which later became the San Diego Museum of Art, who invited Robert Henri to Southern California. You can see this particular work here is inscribed here in the corner to Alice Clobber. Alice Clobber was a great arts patron. She was an artist. She was a promoter of both American and Asian art. She encouraged the Fine Arts Gallery of San Diego to collect both local artists, California artists, and the arts of Asia at a time when it wasn't interested in these things. She had society connections. I've read the society pages in the San Diego newspapers around 1914, and there was this obsession with Spanish culture, and they would have these parties, and the women would dress up like flamenco dancers, and Alice Clobber was often there, minding the coffee table. And she always stayed in touch with Henri, and she had in fact approached him about compiling a book like The Art Spirit, but he wrote her back and said, "Oh, don't bother, another student is already working on that." So you might think these works are depicting Alice Clobber, since if you didn't see my title there and you just saw that, oh, he gave these portraits of these women, or this portrait of a woman on the left to Alice, then of course it must be Alice. Oh, no. This is Robert Henri's second wife, Marjorie Henri, and she had, this beautiful red hair that he painted many times in in his paintings, in his portraits, sometimes in these long, extravagant dresses, here quite casually wearing a beach hat. You can see the two paintings, very similar, same clothing, created obviously in the same moment while they were in San Diego. She wears this beach hat with the purple and red hues of the scarf that wrap around her straw hat, but her brooch also has these great purple colors. Particularly here in the San Diego portrait, you know, you can see there's kind of a luminosity to her skin, and yet also there's a flatness, you know, not using lots of different colors in terms of the representation of her flesh. The background is predominantly yellow, but on the sides he applies green. This, again, the sense of someone, not a naturalistic rendering, the feeling of someone, the rigorous application of the paint that you can see again across her blouse, you know, are signature aspects of Henri's work. The painting on the right, as you can see, is in the collection of the Detroit Institute of the Arts. I always thought it would be nice someday to reunite them and see them side by side. There's Alice. So Alice Clobber had a lot of reasons to invite her old friend Robert Henri to San Diego. Obviously, Henri was taken with the sunshine of Southern California, and we see that in his color palette. But she didn't just think it would be great for his art. She had other motives. San Diego was planning a Panama, California exposition for 1915, a fair that would take over Balboa Park. Balboa Park, still today, is one of the country's largest municipal parks. And, you know, like most fairs, there would be representations of cultures around the world, different types of art, pre-Columbian art, southwestern ceramics, textiles, and Alice Clobber wanted a modern exhibition of art. She didn't just want local California painters. She wanted to present the great painters working in the United States, you know, around 1915, to show everyone how modern San Diego could be. So she called Robert Henri, invited him to Southern California, and said, why don't you stay in the summer? You can live in La Jolla on a cottage on the beach and help organize an exhibition. So Robert Henri brought his wife Marjorie. Here they are. Here's a historic photo of them in Venice, enjoying the beachside. These are two Christmas cards around the time that they were in San Diego. You can see the great portrait of Henri and his wife Marjorie in this work that they sent to Alice Clobber. Here is the exhibition that Robert Henri organized in San Diego. It included works by the students who were so inspired by him: George Lukes, George Bellows, Guy Pendubois, John Sloan, and of course, works by himself. It was the first time in the history of San Diego that American artists of national prominence were shown in the city. The building, this is the Museum of Man today in San Diego. It was built for the 1915 Panama, California exposition. The show was actually directly across from this building. But unfortunately, even Robert Henri's name and his connection with the local community did very little for the exhibition's success. The local San Diego critics were not ready for it. They criticized the exhibition immensely, and not one painting sold in the presentation. But from a historian's perspective, it's a pretty interesting and fascinating event to have, you know, that level of American art at that time being shown in San Diego, which is still very much a beach community at that time. And it's a pivotal changing moment in terms of how American art is viewed on the West Coast. Now, mind you, it's kind of interesting also as well to think about the period 1915. We have artists in New York and Paris creating wholly abstract canvases. But the works, the representational works of our Ashcan school and their want for urban realism were still considered to be a bit much in certain areas of the country. These are just some ephemera images that I have from the San Diego, Panama, California exposition. While in San Diego, one of the things that Alice Clobber had really encouraged Robert Henri to travel there was because she said there are very many interesting people to portray in your paintings. So there'll be interesting subjects. And remember his approach, his want to portray diverse people in his work. San Diego had a Native American population. It had a Chinese American population, Mexican American population. And so there, Henri created some of his most iconic works. Ironically, sometimes San Diego is kind of written out of that story. We so much think of Robert Henri's sense of place as being embodied by Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, specifically, New York City. But again, he was not fixed. He moved around, and he wanted to identify with diverse places and people. This particular painting in the Denver Art Museum's collection, it's always on view, which is nice, except for this summer when there will be an exhibition at the Laguna Art Museum in Laguna Beach on Robert Henri's California. Two other works that Robert Henri created in California. The background here of the Milwaukee art picture, that bright yellow, much brighter than the portrait of Mrs. Robert Henri. It really stands out as quite distinctive in Robert Henri's work. Again, that influence of Southern California, that broad, yellow, expansive background in this portrait add to the modernity of the picture. The work on the left was a study, it was a demonstration piece. It's not a complete piece. He did this for a group of students in San Diego. But in the background, knowing the treatment of the face, even the hands, knowing that it's not a complete piece, that it's a demonstration piece, you can see some of the distinctive brushstrokes as well, as opposed to the more complete background, but how quickly some of these marks are made on the composition. From San Diego, Robert Henri was inspired to go to a new place, and that was New Mexico in Santa Fe. The portrait on the right is of Edgar Hewitt, an anthropologist and an archaeologist. He founded the Museum of New Mexico, which now is an umbrella of 6 institutions, including the Museum of International Folk Art. Have any of you been to the Manila Museum to see their exhibition on Santa Fe? You can see in that exhibition they have information about Edgar Hewitt, and they also have a Robert Henri painting right when you walk in from his time in New Mexico. Edgar Hewitt and Robert Henri met in San Diego as a result of the Panama, California exposition in 1915. And Edgar Hewitt said, come to New Mexico. There are plenty of interesting people to paint there, and we would love to see you and all of that. So they became great friends, collaborators. And these are the types of paintings that we see Robert Henri producing in New Mexico. Similar to the types of works he created in Spain, there are often elements of cultural tradition, references to cultural heritage, whether it's in the clothing or in the background details. There's this reminder of Native American culture. Like many American artists working in the 1920s, 1930s, there was a great inspiration to travel to New Mexico, an inspiration that was provided through the art, the traditional arts, the ceramics, the textiles, but also by the people who lived in New Mexico. Actually, throughout this year, our neighbors, the Manila Museum, will be hosting exhibitions that deal with this topic and the allure of the American West for many American painters. Pepita, on the left, in the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, was another subject that Robert Henri painted many, many times, but not as many times as this young woman, who Robert Henri painted 22 times during his travels to New Mexico. Her name was Berna Escudero, and the painting here, Bernadita. I love the way that she looks out to us and exchanges our gaze at her in this particular composition, more so perhaps than the woman, the girl on the right from Santa Clara. We have this really more bold, sort of giving the subject more agency than in some of his other New Mexico pictures. But it seems fitting now that we'll focus more on our painting here of Maine. It's a small painting. When when I'm new here, for many of you who don't know, I joined the museum on October 28th. And when I was asked to come to campus to give a job talk, my wonderful colleague, who I think is here, Sandy Todd, says, you'll get to pick a painting in the collection to talk about. And I knew immediately it was going to be Robert Henri's painting because of my longstanding admiration and interest in his work. And then I got a little package in the mail from Sandy, and there was a list of the objects I could choose from. There was no Robert Henri painting on the list. So I'm glad to be able to share with you some of my experience and knowledge of Robert Henri today. Maine, we're talking about New Mexico and the Manilo's efforts this year. Maine has also been a hot spot for American artists. The American photographer Berenice Abbott traveled Highway 1 from Maine to Daytona Beach, taking some very iconic photos just down the street. But after she made it to Florida, she decided to live the rest of her life in Maine. And she created many wonderful portraits of lobster traps and lobster workers in Maine. Marston Hartley spent the last years of his life, he was experiencing issues with blindness, and he painted some wonderfully expressive paintings of the ocean in Maine. Robert Henri, too, traveled to Maine, and like his experience with Spain, it wasn't just once or twice. He went back again and again and again. He traveled there early on with his first wife, Linda, and following her death, he did not return to Maine for a number of years. It wasn't till around 1911 that he would return with his second wife, Marjorie, after having been there in 1903. He first spent some time here in this harbor near Bath, but later, the real source of his inspiration would be Mohegan Island, which is right here on our map. Mohegan Island in the 2000 census had a population of 75, but it is an island that has attracted some of the great American painters of the first half of the 20th century. Here's our painting. Robert Henri, which we love about him, I love about him, is that he kept a lot of records. Any art historian appreciates an artist that records their paintings and writes descriptions. It makes it much easier to track. This work, painted in the summer of 1911, he wrote in his artist book, "Dead trees against dark, blue sky at top, mountain ash." So you can see here, the very top of the painting, we have that spot of blue light. This work, though, for the most part, is very dark, much more evocative of those portraits, the portraits he made in Europe, for example, and even later, like Bernadita in New Mexico, but not the bright colors, his bright palette of his San Diego years. Robert Henri used a palette knife, particularly in the lower quadrant of the painting, to spread the paint. We have this impasto, this thickly applied paint in the lower region of the painting. In his book, The Art Spirit, or the compilation of his lectures and writings that is the book, The Art Spirit, we find this quote by Robert Henri. "I find nature as is a very wonderful romance, and no man-made concoctions have ever beaten it either in romance or sweetness." So Robert Henri, like his approach to New York, the streets of New York, he wanted a sense of realism, the sense of feeling that he got from his portraits, from his subjects, that was embodied as well in his landscapes of Maine. This work, in a private collection, sold by a gallery a number of years ago, so I don't actually know exactly where it is, but you can see the pastel on paper version of these trees, these dead trees here, and then mountain ash. This is the type of tree here that we see in this particular work. Here are my pictures for you of the mountain ash tree. And you can see even the way they kind of hang here on these leaves, the way they like slope down, is kind of the sense that we have in the actual painting by Henri. The way the leaves and the red, the mountain ash trees, that they float down. This painting on the left, another work sold at auction in 1996 called The Gray Woods. We see even more of an expressive Robert Henri. Talking about, as I was mentioning, wholly abstract canvases, our artist here is really creating quite a modern representation. It's as though the lower quadrant of our painting here, our painting is at its most abstract in the lower part, has become almost this entire side of the canvas, that just expressiveness, that thickly applied paint in his depiction of these paintings, these landscapes of Maine in 1911. Both of these paintings were exhibited at the Macbeth Gallery in New York in 1911 in an exhibition of his recent Maine pictures. He was immensely prolific in Maine. He recorded, hundreds of paintings over the years inspired by his time in Maine, and he recorded them in his books. This is another great painting from Maine in which we see not only the painter's hand and the application of the paint, but also that very thickly applied paint and creating that impasto in his depiction of the Barnacles. One thing I want to say about these works is how sort of tight the composition is, how sort of we frame in the forest here in these works. These works are really stand out. They're very distinctive in Robert Henri's landscapes, these depictions of the forest. Because as we move forward and I put into context these works and see some other images of different types of landscapes he made, you'll see more traditional representations of the landscape, the seaside or the horizon of the expansive American landscape. This work, two very similar works. This one created approximately from 1902 to 1903. It's in a private collection. The Wyoming Valley is in Pennsylvania, not Wyoming. And his first wife, Linda, had lived, her parents lived there, and so he visited it often. The Milwaukee Art Museum has a very similar painting to this, which is interesting because it was dated 1903, which has made historians believe that, even though these paintings might have the feeling of being created outdoors, these quick brush strokes that, later this one painted at one point, then the other painted very similarly, were clearly being created in studios as opposed to solely being sketched outdoors. Robert Henri was very much exposed to open-air painting when he was in France and traveling in Europe. He initially was very taken with the work of the French Impressionists, but later said it was too much about aesthetics. It was too much about beauty in the way he saw it. And he thought his own approach to landscape was in a way a more rejection, not only a rejection of academic tradition, but also a rejection of the Impressionist point of view. In the art spirit, specifically about landscapes, Robert Henri expresses this sentiment. A landscape has got to mean a great deal to anyone before it can be painted in any worthwhile way. It is harder to see a landscape than to paint it. This is true because there are lots of clever people who can paint anything, but lacking the seeing power, painting nothing worthwhile. As I mentioned to you, Henri spent some time in Ireland. A number of years ago, a museum in North Carolina, I believe it was the Mint Museum, organized an exhibition of the children that he painted in Ireland. But he was also, although art history has most often focused on his portraits, he did create a number of landscapes in Ireland. His second wife, Marjorie Henri, who we've talked about quite a bit, he nicknamed her O. She had been born in Ireland, and so after they married, they traveled to Ireland on a number of occasions. Two very different representations. Here we have the more thickly applied paint that we're talking about with our particular landscape by Henri and the other works that we looked at from his time in Maine. And then in this work, we have much more traditional application of paint, although the forms, the sinewy line of the coast, the deepness of the sea give the painting a rather modern feel. As I mentioned earlier, one of Henri's great legacies was as teacher. And we have a representation of his experience in Maine, but an important part of knowing about Henri's time in Maine and the paintings he created there is that he also encouraged some of his favorite students to travel to Maine. We have George Bellows here, two representations of Maine, representations created on Monhegan Island, where he learned from his teacher Robert Henri to travel. Also Edward Hopper, Rockwell Kent, were encouraged by their teacher Robert Henri to travel to Maine. You can see, particularly with the Lobster Cove piece, the foaming ocean. And it's so beautiful in person, and it's very hard to reproduce. But this rock land here is a coral color. It's like a pink coral color. And that expressiveness of paint, these artists were really creating quite modern compositions. American art is often criticized as being so far behind European trends or so dependent on European trends. And certainly, there is a dependency, and that is, sort of the history of Western art. Many of our American artists did travel abroad and learn quite a bit from studying in the academies of France and Rome. But, thinking about these works, 1911, 1913, really rigorous application of paint to create quite iconic modern representations of Maine. Here's Edward Hopper, his work in the Whitney Museum of American Art, another great work that was really facilitated by Robert Henri in his introduction to these artists of Maine and Monhegan Island. And back to Henri. I started today's lecture by reading a quote from Yi-Fu Tuan, and I thought it would be fitting to conclude with a quote by Yi-Fu Tuan. He wrote, again, in Place, Art, and Self, "Geography is mostly about how we strive to feel at home on Earth, rooted in place, yet we never quite succeed. The arts, too, can be a home, or make us feel more at home. Yet, even more than geographic place, they have the power to disturb or exalt, and so, like the great teachings of religion, remind us that we are fundamentally homeless." Robert Henri, from a very young age, traveled frequently with his family, whether they were escaping the power of the law or just traveling to experience the great western expanse of the United States in places like Nebraska and Colorado. Obviously, he was born in Ohio. But later on, he continued that spirit, though he got training in New York, in Philadelphia and in Paris, and like many artists settled in New York, he was a restless spirit. And he traveled to Southern California, New Mexico, Ireland, Spain, and Maine. And because of that, he spread his teachings and created a diverse body of work in terms of the people he portrayed and the topography he rendered. And our painting is a wonderful way to remember him as teacher, but also as artist. So thank you.